Welcome, everybody. My name is Grant Whiteoff. I'm a postdoc in the Department of English here at Columbia, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our first panel this morning in this conference on description. And it's a panel that I think has been brilliantly organized, something I can take absolutely no credit for, because I think in one way or another, each of these speakers explore the indexicality of a description and that to which it refers, the distance between things and words, sounds and things, words and events, in each paper, respectively. We will begin with Joanna Stalnaker, who is an associate professor of French here at Columbia. Professor Stalnaker works on intellectual history, the history of science, and literary studies to approach questions of representation and knowledge during the French Enlightenment. Her book, The Unfinished Enlightenment, Description in the Age of the Encyclopedia, published in 2010, explores the contours of description as a historically contingent and highly discursive practice in both literature and the natural sciences. This first talk, titled Description and Extinction, is drawn from her new book project, The Enlightenment's Last Words. Georgina Kleege is a novelist and essayist who teaches creative writing and disability studies in the Department of English at UC Berkeley. Professor Kleege's writings have appeared in the Yale Review, the Journal of Visual Culture, and the Southwest Review, among many other venues. Her book, Blind Rage, Letters to Helen Keller, was published in 2006, a creative nonfiction collection of letters that criticizes the Helen Keller myth for prolonging an unrealistic model for blind people, yet appreciates the individual who found a practical way to live despite the restrictions of her myth. Today, Professor Kleege will speak about audio description standards for blind audiences in museum, film, and theatrical contexts. Her talk is titled Audio Description Described. And finally, we have Anne Reynolds, who is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Texas, Austin. Professor Reynolds works on a wide variety of topics and contexts, publishing essays most recently on the experience of remoteness in relation to land art, the performance artist Joan Jonas in a piece for the 2015 Venice Biennale, and Ken Jacobs' 1963 experimental film Blonde Cobra. In 2003, she published with MIT Press Robert Smithson, Learning from New Jersey and Elsewhere, a book that I'm going to have to leave and pick up immediately, being a Jersey kid myself. Reading about the book actually had me learning about a lot of other New Jersey artists coming in here, like William Carlos Williams, who was apparently Smithson's pediatrician. A little fun fact that I liked. Professor Reynolds is currently working on a new book titled In Our Time, a project that explores the social circumstances of various creative communities in New York from the 1940s through the 1960s. And her talk is aptly titled for a Friday, The Cocktail Party.
Thank you. Thank you to Heather and Sharon and Stephen for this opportunity to be here. It was exciting to be able to talk about a topic that I've been working on for way too long and that I initially thought of as very obscure and not interesting to anyone except myself. And so it's great to have this really broad variety of perspectives on the question. I would also like to say that I had a little technological snafu this morning, so all of the pages of my paper say in large letters page 12 on the top. So if I seem like I'm just going in an endless loop, you'll know that I'm on page 12. So this paper is called Description and Extinction. It's actually not from, everything else was right, but it's actually not from my new book, nor is it from the first book on description. It's possibly on a third book that is nowhere near even thought about yet. But it relates, you'll see, to certain of the things that I was interested in my book on description. So one of the goals and challenges of this conference is to expand the conversation about description that has taken place within several disciplines by offering a comparative perspective across the disciplines. What I would like to do in this talk is to take us back to a time before the disciplines existed in their current formation in the second half of the 18th century, and to demonstrate that description was integral to the earliest efforts to define and police the emerging boundary between science and literature. It was during the Enlightenment that description first came into view as a problem that demanded deep theoretical reflection and extensive practical experimentation. And it was indeed in reaction to the immense textual production surrounding the newly visible problem of description that a concept of literature, as distinct from the sciences and specifically centered on the human, took shape. This concept of literature emerged in tandem with the discovery of species extinction and the attendant awareness of the historicity of human life. I would like to take a closer look at this link between description and extinction, both in its late Enlightenment manifestation and as we might understand it today. Ultimately, my goal is to suggest that we are now at a critical juncture in our understanding of literature, one that requires us to think critically about the problem of description across or beyond the disciplines. What place is there for description in a world where we are envisaging not just the extinction of species, but large-scale environmental destruction? And how might our concept of literature shift to accommodate new forms of description, elaborated in response to the environmental challenges facing us? In the space of 20 minutes, it might seem sheer folly or hubris to take on such vast questions. So I will focus my analysis on a speech given by the naturalist Georges Cuvier in 1818 on the occasion of his induction to the Académie Française, France's most prestigious literary society. This speech interests me because it offers an early reflection on what we know today as the two cultures debate, and because it highlights the 18th century practice of description as a fertile but potentially dangerous terrain for the invention of modern literature. At the time of his speech, Cuvier was Secretary of the Academy of Sciences, and in this role he had frequently reported to the members of the Literary Academy on the activities of his fellow scientists. But on this occasion, he spoke not as an outside expert in the natural sciences, but as the newest member of this, quote, supreme tribunal of language and taste, end quote. Cuvier chose as the topic of his speech the mutually beneficent relationship between the sciences and letters in the modern age. He opened his speech by observing that it was especially fitting that he be invited to join the ranks of his fellow academicians at a time when, quote, the sciences extend each day their empire, when nearly their entire idiom seems to pass into the everyday language of which you are charged with collecting the riches and recording the laws, end quote. Yet Cuvier also warned that, quote, it would be equally dangerous for both letters and the sciences to confuse their objects and to apply to the one methods that are suited only to the other, end quote. The goal of his speech was thus to map out the proper divide between literature and science, even as he insisted on their fertile dialogue in a modern scientific age. Cuvier built his speech around a developmental history of literature grounded in the ages of man. He posited 3 ages, quote, in the development of the literature of each people, end quote, an age of inspiration, an age of reflection, and an age of description. And I actually had never read this speech when I was writing my book, where what I was trying to say was that there was an age of the description in the 18th century. The first 2 ages he illustrated with examples drawn from classical and modern literature, with Homer and the Renaissance poet Clément Marot representing the age of inspiration, among others, and Virgil and the neoclassical playwright Jean Racine representing the age of reflection. But when it came to the third age, the age of description, Cuvier insisted that it had begun only recently in the 18th century and thus belonged to the moderns alone. 2 popular writers of the French 18th century served to illustrate Cuvier's age of description. The first was Georges-Louis Leclerc de Buffon, the naturalist whose Histoire naturelle, natural history, had been an important source of inspiration to Cuvier in his youth. And the second was Jacques Delisle, the popular Salon poet who had benefited from Cuvier's scientific collaboration in writing his multi-volume descriptive poem, Les Trois Règnes de la Nature, The Three Realms of Nature, published in 1808. Cuvier gave great importance to these 2 writers, crediting them with introducing a literary age unknown to the ancients. But he also underlined the risks inherent in their innovative practice of description, risks that made it all the more imperative for him to define the proper objects and methods of the sciences and letters for the modern age. Cuvier gave his speech during the Restoration, just 2 years after Louis XVIII had restored the French Academy, following its abolition during the Revolution and its subsequent incarnation as a branch of the Institute during the Napoleonic Empire. He alluded to the historical vicissitudes of the institution at the end of his speech, observing that the Academy was founded in the aftermath of the French Wars of Religion, quote, less to polish the language than to soften the customs that a half-century of discord had made cruel, end quote. This account of the historical context in which the Academy was founded then allowed him to explain its recent abolition during the Revolution. Quote, it was not without motive that, in our time, the discord that has returned under other colors to bloody France yet again sought with such eagerness to destroy your company. but its precaution was in vain. You left immortal replacements, end quote. Here, Cuvier borrowed on the traditional name of the Academy's members, les immortels, the immortals, to insist on the enduring value of literature in the face of dramatic historical and social change. Yet in outlining his literary history, Cuvier hesitated between a transcendent and a historically contingent view of literature. On the one hand, he mapped the age of description onto the third age of man, tying it to the inevitable natural decline of aging. And I quote, "It is not yet that of old age, but it is already no longer that of complete strength," end quote. On the other hand, he characterized the age of description as an unprecedented new beginning in the history of literature, one made possible only by the historical advance of the sciences in the modern age. And I quote, "Let us not try to find out what were the attempts of ancient writers when their literature arrived at this third age, the one that I would almost call the age of description. What could the talent of Oppia and the melancholy genius of Pliny do to paint a nature of which the sciences had hardly lifted the veil? It was to the century of the perfected sciences that it was reserved to celebrate with dignity its miracles. Buffon and Delille will open this third age for us." Cuvier's age of description was thus caught between natural decline on the one hand and historical renewal on the other. Its tenuous status reflected the ambiguities and debates surrounding the very concept of description in 18th century France. If we look to Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, we find 3 separate articles on description. The first, very brief article, treats description in the field of geometry. The second, by Buffon's collaborator Louis-Jean-Marie de Bonton, treats description in the field of natural history. And the third treats description in the field of belles lettres. Unlike the first two, the third article was continually augmented with additions by various authors during the 3 decades that separated its initial publication in 1754 from its final printing in the Encyclopédie méthodique in 1782. During the same period, a new article for the term descriptif, descriptive, was added, in which the literary critic Jean-François Marmontel railed against the so-called descriptive poets for their complete abandonment of classical poetic precepts. Without going into further detail, we can make 3 observations on the basis of this brief overview. First, by the mid-18th century, description required separate definitions for natural history and belles lettres. Second, within the category of belles lettres, the concept was subject to continual debate and modification in the decades leading up to the French Revolution. And third, descriptive poetry was understood as a modern poetic genre that posed a distinct threat to classical poetics. Cuvier promised in his speech an enduring cooperation between the sciences and letters. We might thus assume that he chose Buffon, a man of science, and Delille, a man of letters, to illustrate the fertile dialogue between science and letters that for him marked the modern age. But in fact, Cuvier was deeply ambivalent about the scientific status of Buffon's work. As Dorinda Outram has shown, Cuvier was suspicious of attempts to popularize science, believing that public debates and spectacles would undermine the already fragile claims of the natural sciences to true knowledge. And Buffon was nothing if not a popular writer, his best-selling Histoire naturelle having significantly contributed to the vogue for natural history in 18th century France. Cuvier expressed strong reservations about Buffon's scientific legacy in the eulogies he pronounced as secretary of the scientific branch of the Institute and then the Academy of Sciences between 1799 and 1832. In his eulogy of Buffon's disciple and collaborator, Bernard Germain de la Cepede, he sharply criticized Buffon's scientific method, even as he acknowledged his well-deserved reputation as, quote, one of our most eloquent writers, end quote. As Vincent de Banne has suggested, Cuvier used Buffon's renown as a great stylist as a means of excluding him from an emerging canon of properly scientific writings. Cuvier made a similar effort to police the boundary between scientific and literary writing in his reception speech to the Academy. He did so by opposing the poet Delille's overly detailed descriptions of nature to the naturalist Buffon's broad imaginative views of nature, implying that Delille had lost sight of his poetic mission, while Buffon had strayed too far into the territory of the poet, so they switch places. And I quote, "How fortunate the first, Delille, if from a more elevated point of view, he had encompassed nature in her greatest dimensions. How fortunate the second, Buffon, if he had deigned to lower himself to grasp more coldly her minute details. And yet how admirable both of them for works that had no models either in antiquity or among the people of our day, end quote. This account is symptomatic of the fate that Delille and Buffon would suffer in the history of literature and science, respectively. Already in 1818, it seems that these two writers were doomed to extinction for having crossed the boundary between the sciences and letters. And yet, paradoxically, Cuvier admired them precisely because they ushered in an unprecedented age of collaboration between science and literature. Cuvier delineated the opposition between scientific and literary description even more explicitly in his eulogy of Louis Jean-Marie de Bontemps, the naturalist who contributed anatomical descriptions of quadrupeds to Buffon's Histoire naturelle. Although Cuvier expressed great admiration for the collaboration between these two naturalists, he ended up praising de Bontemps' scientific method at the expense of Buffon's imaginative excesses. So for each quadruped, there's a text that is called a history by Buffon and another text that is called a description by de Bontemps, which is anatomical and proposes a very different approach and method of description. So I quote Cuvier on these two figures. Buffon, of a vigorous size, an imposing visage, an imperious nature, eager in all things for rapid enjoyment, seemed to want to guess at the truth and not to observe it. His imagination placed itself at every instant between nature and himself, and his eloquence seemed to exert itself against his reason before employing itself with carrying off the reason of others. De Bontemps, of a weak temperament, a gentle expression, a moderation that he owed to nature as much as to his own wisdom, brought to all his research the most scrupulous circumspection. He believed, he affirmed only what he had seen and touched. Very far from wanting to persuade by other means than evidence itself, he carefully removed from his speech and from his writings any image, any expression proper to seduce. Of an unfailing patience, he never suffered from a delay. He started the same task over and over again until he had succeeded, in his opinion, and by a method perhaps too rare among men occupied with the real sciences, all the resources of his mind seemed to unite in imposing silence on his imagination, end quote. This double portrait sets up a stark contrast between two ways of describing nature. The first, that of Buffon, views nature through the eyes of the imagination, while the second, that of de Bontemps, imposes silence on the imagination and restricts itself to empirical observation. Although Cuvier praised the Buffon-de Bontemps pair as embodying, quote, that perfect contrast that is necessary to make a union durable, end quote, he did not hide his view that if the Histoire naturelle remained a work of scientific reference in the early 19th century, it was due solely to de Bontemps' anatomical descriptions. His greatest regret was that Buffon had chosen to cut those descriptions from reeditions of the Histoire naturelle starting in 1767 in an effort to appeal to an even broader audience than he already had, and that de Bontemps subsequently stopped collaborating with him for the volumes on birds and minerals. It may not be surprising that Cuvier, whose detailed studies in comparative anatomy allowed him to prove the extinction of species, should have preferred de Bontemps' precise anatomical descriptions to Buffon's more stylish portraits of living quadrupeds. What is surprising, however, is that the poet, Delille, criticized the imaginative excesses of Buffon's descriptions in very similar terms. In his preface to Les Trois Règnes de la Nature, The Three Realms of Nature, Delille acknowledged Buffon as an unparalleled model in the art of description, but he claimed to prefer the austere volumes on minerals, which I have to say are less read than the other volumes, to his infinitely more popular quadruped volumes. If I were permitted to express my opinion on the style of this great man, so this is Delille talking about Buffon, if I were permitted to express my opinion on the style of this great man, I would admit frankly that, of all his works, the one whose diction seemed to me the most appropriate to its subject is his treatise on minerals. There, everything is accurate, clear, precise, noble without grandiloquence, rich without profusion, no ambitious images, no superfluous ornaments, nothing exceeds the subject. Monsieur de Buffon knew minerals through the eyes of experience, but he wrote on animals with the interest inspired by their characters, their graces, their beauties, the relations they have with us, and the services they render us. Already the pomp of style, the exalted ideas, the brilliant and poetic diction, which, after having made the fortune of the work, have become, for many readers, an object of reproach, end quote. Delisle did quickly backtrack after making this criticism, granting that Buffon, quote, having to paint the marvels of nature, was more authorized to deploy in his work all the pomp of his style and all the riches of his imagination. And how can we fail to appreciate the one who, by the magic of his language, gave such a strong impetus to his century, end quote. But overall, Delisle left his readers with the impression that as a poet, he shared the values of scientific description delineated by Cuvier, even in his own poetry. Buffon could serve as a model for the descriptive poet only to the extent that he silenced his imagination and avoided his tendency toward poetic prose, a mixed genre Delisle likened to a monster, a bat, and an amphibian. Paradoxically, then, Delisle joined Cuvier in policing the boundary between scientific and literary description, qualifying Buffon's quadruped volumes as excessively literary, even as he claimed to emulate the more properly scientific descriptions of the mineral volumes in his own poetry. In an age when scientific language was entering the idiom of letters, what would prevent the poet from straying too far into the territory of the scientist? And Delisle refers to a disenchanted age in which the poet just says nature instead of singing nature. Cuvier took up this question in bringing his speech to a dramatic close. Alluding to recent research, so I'm back to Cuvier's reception speech to the Académie Française. Alluding to recent research into the history of the Earth and its past life forms, Cuvier insisted that in the face of scientific discoveries that seemed to dwarf man, it was all the more imperative that literature not lose sight of him. And this is an insistent theme throughout the speech, but it reaches this sort of moment of culmination in the conclusion to the speech. And I quote Cuvier, "Every investigation into the depths of the earth increases by 100-fold the revolutions it has undergone. Life on earth covers over ruins. Those ruins lie on other ruins. The rich and varied life forms of this universe were preceded by an infinity of other forms that all had their own varieties and riches. Have I not been mistaken? Surrounded by such glories, will man not seem quite small? Swept along by all these splendors, will letters not forget him? No, they cannot. Of all these marvels, man is the greatest. Science has submitted this universe to him." End quote. The vision of literature with which Cuvier concluded his speech was explicitly tied to recent evolutions in the natural sciences. If human history now appeared as a brief flicker against the backdrop of a dramatically expanded history of the earth, and if each of life's varied forms was now known to be subject to extinction, this apparent diminution of man only magnified his importance in literature. Yet as Cuvier and his listeners well knew, Delisle had founded his poetic project on the notion that descriptive poetry, unlike dramatic poetry, entailed a rare poetic sensibility that was distinct from the passions of social life. As he described it, this sensibility involved a kind of decentering of man. And I quote, "It is the kind of sensibility that gives an interest to objects that are the most foreign to man, that makes him participate in the destiny, happiness, and death of an animal, or even of a plant." Cuvier's insistence that literature must not lose sight of man thus ran directly counter to the poetics of the age of description, the very age of description that he lauded in his speech. In this sense, Cuvier's speech was symptomatic of a much broader critical reaction against the descriptive projects of the Enlightenment and descriptive poetry in particular that would make them appear unreadable for over 2 centuries. And I'm very interested in this idea of a literary genre or a practice of writing that becomes unreadable or invisible and then reemerges at a later historical period. Almost as soon as it had been opened by the bold moderns that were Buffon and Delisle, the third age of description was nearing its end. It is often said that readers of novels tend to skip over descriptions in their desire to get back to the real story. But the descriptive projects of the 18th century offer a different kind of reading experience in which there was no story to get back to. In his article Descriptif, descriptive, Marmontel objected vociferously to such works, remarking, quote, that a poem without object, without design, be a series of descriptions introduced by nothing, that the poet looking around himself describe everything that presents itself for the sole pleasure of describing, if he does not find it tiresome himself, he can be sure that his readers will soon find it so, end quote. Although Buffon and Delille were among the most popular and widely read authors of their time, Marmontel was right in the sense that their works quickly fell into obsolescence in the early 19th century with the increasing polarization of literature and science. Yet I believe that we are today at a moment when we are prepared to question Cuvier's vision of literature, both in its insistence on the primordial importance of man and in its delineation of the opposing values of science and literature. Both Buffon's amphibian prose and Delille's sensibility for things foreign to man may once again be relevant to us as we contemplate the extent to which the fate of the earth has become entwined with our own. To describe nature, as Buffon and Delille did so, is to give it value quite apart from any human story, and to demand its preservation in terms that transcend the historically contingent opposition of science and literature. Thank you.
Is it all right if I stand?
Yes.
It's always amusing to me to know that you want to see the speaker. I'll try to make it worth your while. My name is Georgina Kleege, and I'm going to talk today about audio description. Audio description is a set of practices meant to make visual media, visual culture, accessible to blind and visually impaired people. Audio description has been around at least since the 1980s, but it's only just recently that it's begun to be scrutinized and critiqued in any kind of organized scholarly manner. And so my main mission in being here, and why I'm grateful to Heather and Sharon and Stephen for inviting me, is I'm here to recruit you to this cause of scholarly interventions into these practices. Just briefly, there are different forms of audio description relative to the media being described. So there's one set of practices for the fine arts, for painting, sculpture, fine art photography, etc., in museums. I'm going to be talking primarily today about audio description of film and video, though it's also available in live theater performance. As I say, my mission is here to recruit you, so I'm trying to think of the best way to draw you into this experience. I could have brought you some examples of audio description to watch, but in some ways it would be unfair to pick one version over another as exemplary. So I invite you, if you've never watched an audio-described movie or television program, I encourage you to go forth and find such media. And the way to find them is if you have a DVD of a movie that has audio description, and this is a relatively rare thing, though it exists with greater and greater frequency. If you go to the menu where you would select subtitles or captioning, you would find something that says either descriptive video, described version, or something. So there'd be something with the term of description there, and you can turn that on. On a television program, you would deploy the SAP button on your remote, the secondary audio program, and then the audio description would be available. And I think anybody in this room who watched any audio described media would immediately discover problems. And I won't enumerate all the problems. I'll just enumerate a few. Now, to be fair, I don't know why I should be fair, but to be fair, audio description of moving image or live theater is a very particular task, which is different from audio description in museums and art galleries, just because of the issue of time. That audio description, as currently performed, is meant to occur in the silences between dialogue and other sounds on the soundtrack. So it needs to be scripted and timed so that it doesn't overlap dialogue or other sounds. So it can be audible, and the regular soundtrack can also be audible. So a very, very difficult task. However, one of my main problems with audio description, and why I think it would be of interest to you, is the standards. And since the 1980s, the standards have become more and more, the field has become more and more professionalized. There are now training programs, there are books, there are conferences to train people to do this work. And one of the main imperatives, one of the first principles of audio description for blind people is that it must be neutral and objective. That the role of the describer is not to interpret, evaluate, or impose a judgment, but is simply to describe. Now, I think everybody in this room could already perceive a problem with this. And just to quote Sharon's introduction yesterday, when she said that description always involves interpretation and evaluation, or Heather earlier today saying that description is always already interpretation. Now, we may quibble with that to some degree. The people who do audio description for the blind believe that description without interpretation, without evaluation, is possible and desirable. And I believe this notion comes to them, I believe what they think they're doing is that somehow if they use language correctly, that language can enter the brain of the blind person where it can ignite a mental image in the blind person's mind's eye, which the blind person then can interpret and form an independent, unmediated aesthetic judgment. And the premise is that the belief is that if a sighted viewer can form an autonomous, unmediated aesthetic judgment, then you want to make this possible for a blind person. My quibble with this is extensive. But just briefly, aside from what you may all be thinking about description, interpretation, evaluation, is this notion of the mind's eye in the blind person. Speaking personally, I don't know that I have a mind's eye, or if I have a mind's eye, it's equally impaired as my physical eyes. I do not routinely, when I hear words, find that there's some kind of image popping up somewhere. So I sort of appreciate the wishful thinking of the audio describers, that somehow they can heal this deficiency in the blind people with the magic of language. But as I say, there are problems with this. And I'll just enumerate a couple of problems with this standard audio description and this imperative about objectivity and neutrality. The first is that there is often a withholding of information, a failure to identify objects or facial expressions or gestures for fear that this would be doing the work of interpretation. So, for instance, and this has actually been critiqued, and now it's sort of less standard, but it used to be quite common that a describer would describe a facial expression as she turns up the corners of her mouth, rather than saying she smiles. Now, thinking about the economy of language, to say she smiles is fewer words than she turns up the corners of her mouth. So there's a trade-off, given that you have to time this language to fit in silences. But you can imagine how, in many instances, this sort of failure to interpret can actually become a distortion. Because if you're listening to this, you're thinking, turns up the corners of her, oh, is she smiling? And already, 5 lines of dialogue have gone by while you're making that assessment. I could say more, but I'll move on to another issue. The other issue, and this is something that's not often talked about, is that because there's this rule about objectivity and neutrality, it also has an impact on the vocal production. That is to say, the vocal performance of the audio describers. Because in my mind, this is a performance, that the people who do this tend to be people who have vocal training. Many of them were trained as actors, some as singers. Many of them have worked as voiceover artists in commercials and so on and so forth. So they're trained voices. They're not just average people off the street who are speaking. But because there's this imperative about objectivity, all the describers use a tone I would describe as neutral, but perky. That is to say, there's a quality of voice. It's as if the person is sort of behind you, speaking in your ear, over your shoulder. I am here, I am attending, I'm going to supply this information to you. I'm not going to judge anything that occurs. But I'm friendly. I'm not your friend, but I'm friendly. I'm helpful. Okay. And this tone is maintained regardless of the content of the scene or movie. So it might be an exciting chase scene or a graphic scene of violence or a steamy love scene, and that tone is maintained. He takes the knife and stabs her repeatedly in the chest. Blood spurts on the wall. And this can be disconcertingly at odds with what's going on. I quibble with this, and I compare these practices to what a blind person experiences most of the time with screening movies or television programs. That is to say, since audio description, though increasing in availability, is still rare, most blind people rely on friends, family members to provide description. And two things. One is, I think the idea that when a blind person comes to a film or a television program cold, without prior knowledge, is maybe something worth contesting. That, like everybody else, when I watch a movie or a TV program, there is I've experienced a certain amount of anticipatory description, in that I've read a review or somebody has told me something. I have some prior knowledge of what it is that I'm going into. And that provides me with context, which is 90% of the time what I need. During a movie or television program, usually what I require is if there's any sort of text on the screen, or somebody's reading a letter, or an email, or whatever it is, to have somebody read that to me. Occasionally, if a line of dialogue says, "Stop shaking that thing in my face," I would like to know what's being shaken in somebody's face, unless it's already clear from context. And then beyond that, sight gags. Some bit of humor which turns on a visual element. So the most frequently asked question by blind people, of sighted people, when at the movies is, why was that funny? Which is a complicated question, but sometimes it's just because, he slipped on a banana peel or whatever. So there's anticipatory description. There's sort of description whispered, or spoken out loud if you happen to be screening at home. And then there's retrospective description. That is to say, if viewing a television program or a movie is a social activity, there's the opportunity after the fact, in discussion of what did you think of that, did you like that, the opportunity to say, in that scene where such and such happened, what was going on? And that question is often generative of interpretation, debate, so on and so forth. So anticipatory description, retrospective description have always been part of my independent viewing of visual media. The other thing I wanted to put forward about the neutral but perky tone is to think of this in comparison to other experiences of description not for blind people. Take, for instance, radio broadcasts of baseball. As you know, if you listen to play-by-play of baseball in particular, but other sports also, you know that a good play-by-play commentator projects with his voice what's going on, even anticipating, so that there's the sound of a ball hitting a bat. And you can tell by the calm or excited tone of the commentator whether it's a high foul ball out of play or a home run. That the excitement in the person's voice generates something. And also generates, I think, excitement in the listener. A friend of mine got into her car recently, and her son had left the radio on at a high volume. And when she started the car, it came on, and there was an exciting play in a baseball game. And she found herself kind of excited before she even registered what she was listening to. So that there's something there's something contagious about the human voice and what it does to listeners. And this is something that I experience when somebody is describing something to me and they get excited. So as opposed to he took the knife and stabbed her repeatedly in the chest, to have someone say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," which doesn't describe anything, but it does get me excited. And then after the fact, I can figure out what was so disturbing. Anyway. I have so far taken my quibbles to the professionals in audio description, and I bump up against a wall. So I've turned elsewhere to kind of recruit people, such as yourselves. But in particular, I've recently been trying to recruit the artists themselves, filmmakers, video artists, and have tried to inspire them to think of audio description as, first of all, to let them know about it, and then to inspire them to think about including audio description in the original design of their work. That is to say, to build it in rather than bolt it on, to have it a part of their artistic conception from the outset, rather than as something that's done in post-production and turned over to the supposed experts. And though at one time I used to have some frustrating conversations with friends who are filmmakers who would say, well, you know, every image is so complex it would take the hundreds of thousands of words and hundreds of thousands of hours to describe it. It's just impossible. It can't be done. And on one level, I agree, it can't be done. And then on the other level, I think, well, but has it been tried? Really? More recently, I had a very good experience talking about this at the Edinburgh Film Festival. And I was on a panel, and I think that the context helped. I was on a panel on access. And I was paired, so the organizers were pairing the concept of linguistic access, meaning subtitling and dubbing of films, and sensory access, meaning audio description and closed captioning for deaf people. And our audience, so basically the speaker doing linguistic access, and I did basically the same presentation, though in different versions. He showed, versions of films with subtitles, which went terribly, terribly wrong. And everybody in the audience said, oh, that's so terrible. How could they have translated it that way? How awful. And I showed versions of audio-described films, and everybody, oh, why did they do that? And they didn't say that, and that was ridiculous. And that voice, what is that neutral, perky tone? And so we had a very receptive audience. And somebody suggested, actually, got so inspired by this, talked about how what films should be doing is have a access producer who would handle both of these things simultaneously. These filmmakers were all independent filmmakers, mostly from non-English speaking countries. So they were interested in getting into English speaking markets where all the money is. And so they saw access as yet another feature that could make this possible. But I was also trying to persuade them to think about what it would mean to imagine a blind viewer from the outset, and how audio description might be available to everyone, might be a part of the whole soundtrack, and what that would do to the aesthetic. A sort of silly example of this was told to me as an anecdote by a friend whose elderly father was somewhat technologically challenged. And he watched a DVD at home, and he turned on the audio description by mistake. And he didn't realize what it was. So he heard this disembodied voice commenting on the action while he was watching the movie. But he thought it was part of the movie. And so his daughter asked him after the fact, what did you think of the movie? And he said, well, you know, at first it seemed a very conventional kind of narrative film. But it had this other element. There was this voice, and it really drew my attention to the characters' gestures and their facial expressions and different objects. And it was very, very modern. And so it kind of piqued my interest to think, well, what if you did that on purpose? What if that was on purpose. So I put that out there for any filmmakers in the room to think about, what if you did that on purpose? But to everybody in the room, I wanted to introduce you to an online intervention in this whole area. This is a experimental online platform called YouDescribe, which is spelled capital Y-O-U, capital D-E-C-R-I-B-E, youdescribe.org. And it was invented by a man named Josh Mealy, M-I-E-L-E, who's based in San Francisco, is blind himself, and like most blind consumers of audio description, has issues with how it's typically done. So he set up this platform to crowdsource audio description so that anybody can go into the site, search for a video on YouTube, and then record and upload their own description. The site is still, as I say, is experimental. It's kind of in the record-breaking soft launch. They keep adding new features to it. But it is there, and it's available, and it's the crowd. So the examples that are available there are vary in quality. I'll put it that way. But it is something that I and other people that I know have started using as an assignment for students to assign them to do a YouDescribe project, typically related to some course material. And rather than giving them the rules of the professional describers, I and others are trying to innovate and encourage creativity. What do you think needs to be described? How do you think is the best way to do it? YouDescribe offers different ways of supplying description, which could be comparable to sort of thick and thin description. So it's possible to do the inline version, that is to say, like the standard version, where the description is in between dialogue, right? So that the video plays continuously. It can also be done so that the video pauses on a still, and then there can be longer description supplied. And then when that ends, the video then continues. And the third level, which I hope that they're launching soon, would have an audible signal, which would let the viewer, the auditor, know that if you want to pause it, you can listen to even longer description, even thicker description. And so that the viewer has the opportunity sort of to pick and choose. Okay. So the site has this possibility of innovating in terms of different levels of description. It also has the possibility that a consumer could access different versions of description. So that the same video could be described from different viewers, different describers, and a viewer, auditor, could listen to different versions, and different information would be accreted over time. So I throw that out to you as a possibility, as a place, as a playground for experimentation and innovation, because it's much needed. And finally, I just wanted to put forward a notion of a sort of social change agenda, and offer you a sort of alternative between notions of accommodation and notions of inclusion. So audio description as typically practiced is an accommodation, right? And, I'm not going to quibble with the need for accommodation and my gratitude for accommodation. But still, it's based on a notion that the disabled person needs to be fixed in some way, right? So you give them something that fixes something. Versus inclusion, which says, what is it about the culture or the architecture or the practices here which exclude certain people? And what is it that we can do to change those practices to include not only this one set of people, which would be blind people in this case, but to include other people who might appreciate the addition of language, of description, might find that a useful addition to visual media. And so the idea is that in dealing with previously marginalized, excluded people, the idea of accommodation is to say, okay, you can come in here, you can stand over there, and we'll explain the culture to you. Don't touch anything. And then you can go home to wherever it is that you come from. Versus the notion of inclusion, which says, come in here, and we recognize and embrace the idea that the culture is going to change simply by your presence. So to translate that back to the mission, the recruitment of filmmakers, visual artists, and scholars, is thinking about how does the presence of the blind viewer change what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to get back to the question of exhaustiveness, because it seems to me in relation to Joanna's talk especially, that there's a sense that exhaustion is beyond human attention. So you have a multi-volume work and the sense that you move in and out of attentiveness, that in fact we can't absorb description. So most of us have been talking about description as output, but then there's the question of how much you can input of the description. And so, and I say this because I was thinking of my mother especially, who has dementia and whose attention span is and memory, so she cannot remember what happened in the last scene in a TV show, for instance. So can we think about description as, I mean, I think it has a risk of, if not risk, or promise of being inhuman in a sense, especially as technologies allow greater and greater amounts of description, either in the codex form or in a digital form. Can we talk about our inability to, or the limits of our ability to take in description a little bit?
No. I'm not sure. I think I have to think more about the question of inability to take it in and sort of the effect that it might have on a reader through its excess, although, you know, the writers that I was working on are very concerned about that problem. But just one thing about attention that I would say is that I emphasize Delille being concerned about this sort of decentering, you know, with trying to get people to be attentive to things they wouldn't normally be attentive to. So that's sort of what poetry is supposed to be for him, is get us to, he says, you know, French, seems kind of paradoxical in a way, but he says the French are not sensitive to nature at all, basically, in comparison to the English. So through this poetry, we're going to get them to actually stop just worrying about dramatic poetry and the passions of social life and get them to sit down and look at a plant. But that's not exactly what you're asking about, so I have to think more about that.
There's also the issue of, you know, description of an invisible object, that is, the invisible to the reader or listener. versus description, which is multimodal, where the audience also has access, so that you can have someone describing a painting while people are looking at the painting, and so that there's a sort of play-by-play going on, a sort of guided tour going on, where the listener and viewer is sort of taking in language and also taking in image, which possibly makes it seem less exhaustive, because there's an agency and an activity to looking versus just receiving the language without the image. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think about how much is too much, and when do you throw up your hands and say, I can't take in anymore. And particularly if you think of a sort of movement from a general description to closer and closer in, sort of getting more and more aware of detail. And how do you sort of lose sight of the periphery as you move closer and closer to the center? And is that, you forget what was said before? Yeah, and how to keep prefacing new elements of description with, as we saw previously, or, as I just said. Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's an interesting thing to think about.
But it's also interesting to think about in terms of descriptions, like you said, if you're not looking at the object.
Yeah.
Because similarly, I think that's kind of what I'm talking about. If I don't have an object or an image of the thing I'm trying to imagine, I get distracted and don't see all the details in the text that I do have, because I don't have a way. I think imagination kind of has to have these hookups somewhere, and so the exhaustion can also just come from that, and it's more kind of not seeing it, or not making the connection as much as it is exhaustion,
Yeah.
too. So absence is key, I think, in that process.
Yeah, I mean, it may go back to the idea of a sort of evocation or a connection with some sensory experience, to say that something looks like it would be fuzzy or whatever.
Right.
That brings it back to one's own sense of embodiment.
Right. Well, that's why the dance metaphors in my description, I think, are deliberate, because they allow people to feel embodied reading it, Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. We are kind of over time, as you probably realize. So I think what